speaker today is Dr. Bill Shane. He has a master's and a PhD in plant pathology, and he is the senior tree extension educator with Michigan State University, housed at the Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center. Bill's going to talk to us today about peaches, pruning, and all that good stuff we need to know. So all yours, Bill.
Okay, thank you so much, and I appreciate the invitation to be part of this presentation. I'm a tree fruit specialist at Michigan State University, and I have focused mainly on peaches over the last 24 odd years here at Michigan State University. I run a peach breeding program, and also I work closely with growers troubleshooting problems. So I've seen a lot. A lot of the information that I will be giving you is kind of a more descriptive, not a lot of data because I'm covering a lot of territory. So my topic today is training and pruning strategies for keeping peach trees healthy and productive. Kind of big topics. First of all, I'd like to say if you've been doing a good job keeping your trees productive and healthy, then you probably should be teaching this course rather than me. But there are major challenges to growing peach trees. And I want to focus in those things that have impact on keeping that tree alive and productive. There are a lot of insects that attack the fruit, and whereas they're troublesome, and that's not what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about the overall productivity of the tree. Borers and scales are insects that will attack the tree and shorten the lifetime of the tree if we don't manage those. And we do have tools for that. That's not a problem. The cold damage, Mother Nature has impact on the tree, and sometimes it seems like we don't have a lot to do with it, but there are some things that you can do. Leucostoma canker is quite often a problem due to cold damage, but it also can be due to tree structural problems or some sort of issues with the site. So these are some of the things that I'd like to address in today's talk. I think it's more that you know about peach varieties and the strengths of the peach variety and weaknesses and the rootstock. I think you have a better chance of having a successful orchard. If you can learn what types are hardier, buy them preferentially, and when you put them in the orchard, put the hardier types in where you know you'll have a little more challenge in that planting, maybe down the lower part of the slope, and put the more tender ones toward the top. I also generally recommend that if you have showy types tend to bloom a little bit earlier, not 100%, but for the most part. So put those in the colder part of the site to slow down development. So you have maybe a little better chance of getting through the bloom with less frost damage. Plant the more vigorous varieties in the parts of that orchard that are a little bit weaker soil. So one of the problems that we see with peaches is that there is a tendency for them to grow too vigorously, particularly if you have rich soils. Also think about strategic planting. If you have varieties that have better resistance to bacterial spot, put those in the areas of the orchard that are exposed to wind, especially if you have a sandy site. Cold damage is a really big problem for those of us like Michigan and your area where we have serious winter problems. And it kind of three different categories. So the rapid temperature drop in the fall, cold temperatures below about 8 degrees in midwinter, and then spring frost when we have green tissue showing out there and blossom. And looking over the last 20 years in Michigan, Southwest Michigan, where I'm from, it's the problems seem to be more in the bloom time for us. So quite often in recent years, that's been the major bottleneck is trying to get a crop to go through the bloom time. However, if you look at the long-term health of that orchard too, it's usually the rapid temperature drops in the late fall or mid-winter temperature drops below 8 degrees that are not only a source of crop loss, but also significant tree damage. And to some extent, we don't have a lot of control over that, but I want to mention a few things as we go along that may help you out. As far as cold damage on the trunk of the tree, we generally see that in two different areas. And the first is in the what we call the cambium tissue. If you peel the bark back, if you have frost damage, you'll see a cinnamon color layer right here. And that's the regenerative area of the tree that forms the wood toward the inside of the tree or the bark toward the outside of the tree. The other type that we see is damage to the xylem tissue, the young xylem tissue. As the tree grows, it puts on more layers of the xylem tissue, and the youngest one is on the outside. Whenever we have a frost damage, freeze damage midwinter, it's usually we'll see the youngest xylem have the impact, and so we'll see that ring, and we can see that ring on into the future. What happens is the tree will form new wood on the outside of that. The cambium damage tends to cause what the trunk splitting, and this gives you an example of damage that we saw back in '94 when we got down to minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit. So the area dies. For the most part, we say that if you have more than about 2/3 of the diameter, the circumference of the trunk that is showing that real dark coloration, then that tree probably won't make it. On the other hand, if you have damage to the xylem further on in the tree, that usually shows up later as a wood rotting fungus, because what happens is that when the fungus is able from some sort of crack or a limb able to get into the older part of the tree, the heartwood of the tree, then that usually results in this fungal growth, and it's a longer term decline of the tree, but it's usually eventually fatal to the tree. And with the trunk splitting with that the damage to the cambium, this is what it looks like. These have been painted over after the freeze, trying to provide some protection. It really doesn't do much for that. But there are cultivar differences in susceptibility to winter damage. And with that type of information, you may be able to do a job of selecting varieties that have higher levels of cold resistance. It's hard to get this data because it depends on having these cold events and having a good test area to evaluate. This is a 5-year-old block, and you can see that we have quite a range of damage due to that freeze. And this was evaluated in the fall after that January freeze. Things like PF Lucky 13 Fantasia, relatively little amount, and this is a significant number of trees. We had 17 to 20 trees per variety in this very uniform block. Whereas on a lot of the varieties that we're familiar, Red Haven is considered a fairly tough tree, but in this situation, there are a lot of varieties that looked better than that. And there's also varieties that looked worse, things like Autumn Star, which we know is fairly susceptible to winter damage. John Boy is a Loring type, PF5D Big, which we had more varieties in this trial, but again, we use the data that we can get our hands on. So to counter that type of problem, choosing your varieties, but you establish new plantings every few years to hedge your bets, because you're never quite sure which age or tree that are going to take it more hard. Older trees tend to have more problems, ones that are on the decline. Sometimes we see very young trees that are hit by this, but hedge your bets. The other thing that we can see is higher up in the tree in the limbs, limb damage from such a freeze. And this shows you the damage, the darker areas where we had the frost damage in 2019. And then we had the new ring of growth on the outside. So this picture was taken 1 year after that low temperature event. So if we compare varieties, this shows you July Prince, which is a variety that we grow in this area of Michigan. Honey Blaze, a newer variety. And you can see that damage to the xylem. And we went through the variety trials at the research station here and classified them similarly. And there is quite a range of susceptibility to that damage up on the limbs. And we see the effects of this play out over the next few years. This happened in 2019, and we're now starting to see some of the ones that had more significant limb damage starting to decline. These informations, this recording will be available after the presentation, so you can go back and look at some of these tables if you like. In trying to avoid problems in your planting, it's important to think about your site. Peaches and nectarines do better on a sandy soil that is deep with good water drainage. pH is kind of average. Choosing rootstocks do help your situation quite a bit. My favorite is Bailey, but Lovell works pretty well. Tennessee Natural is one. Those three would be my favorite. There's other ones that you can get, Halford, Rutgers, Redleaf, Truly Lomtau, that are almost as good. Down the list, Guardian is one from the Southeast. It's there are some hints that it's maybe a little bit more tender midwinter. Crimps 86 is a new one that they are that Sierra Gold is selling a lot of trees on nowadays. We haven't had as much experience with Crimps 86. They do like that one in Colorado, but they are challenged with high pH soils and heavier soils. So there's several in the controller series, root pack series. We're testing them, but we don't have the long-term studies for us to feel confident. And there's another one, MP29 from Byron, Georgia. It's a dwarfing rootstock, but we don't have much tests in cool climates. Setting up your site, your planting considerations are important. Particularly if you have a heavier soil, you know you have a water drainage problem. So a berm is handy. You can use multiple passes with a plow or a disc to heap it up. If you have access to a vegetable bed shaper, this works fairly decently as well. So it's a good strategy if you need it for your soils. Few tips, and the old timers know all these things and have your own twist on these, but important to keep the trees from drying out. You know, often you don't have that control over what happens before it gets to your farm. But I generally recommend, if you have any indication that the roots are less than wonderful, then soak them for a couple hours. Some people like to do it overnight. Have to be careful that you don't have crown gall in your plant, in your trees. If you see signs of crown gall on the rootstock, then you don't want to soak them as a group. You want to hose them separated to moisten them as best you can. Getting that good soil contact is important. Check over the next few days. Make sure that graft union is where it should be. And we see nowadays some nurseries have developed peach trees that look almost like apple trees, high budded, where you get a pretty long distance between the top root and the graft union. And this can run some growers into problems if they're not paying attention, because the kind of a rule of thumb with peaches that you plant the graft union at the soil line. However, if you got that long shank, that really puts the root systems down deep. So if you have a heavier soil, then you might head into a crown rot problem, fight off a crown rot problem by having the root system so low in a heavy soil. So in this situation, it's best to plant so that the top roots are close to the soil line. Just a warning about that. Tree wraps, cages, tree paint. I like painting the trees and using some sort of cage. You can put tree wraps on a short-term basis if you have to do some weed spraying, but in the long term, I think a cage or hardware cloth around a white painted tree is best. General comments on pruning. Best time to prune is in the dormant to delayed dormant time. March and April is for us here in Southwest Michigan. You're a little bit later, perhaps in some of the more northeast areas. I like to do the healthy 5-year-old trees up to 8-year-old trees, 10-year-old trees first, then come back and do the younger ones and the older weak trees. It's less hard on the tree. Try to do the pruning when it's dry, and the forecast for dry conditions. Don't prune within a week before or after a cold damage episode. Look at the forecast. Try not to remove more than about 10 to 15% of the branches. And modest pruning is okay if you have a orchard that you need tweaking. Again, not more than 15%. If you do too much or do it too late, you can increase your chances for winter damage. One thing is very important, in my opinion, is to remove excess limbs on the lower trunk on a new tree as soon as possible, because these pruning scars, especially if they're bigger branches like the one on the right here, are magnets for problems down the road. And give you an example of that. We see that if we have cold temperature events, low temperatures in the midwinter, quite often we'll see the cracking associated with the cambium damage that I showed you, associated with these pruning scars, particularly if they're larger ones. So it is a place that is weak on the tree. So the sooner that you can get those branches off, the smaller the scar that you'll have there and the less problems. I like to, if you whip your trees, take the side branches off at planting, use clothespins as a way to get flat angles on the branches. So I end up clothespinning more branches than I know I want in the final tree. That way I have some choices there. The plastic types you can get from Walmart and other places are bigger. You can go around a bigger diameter tree. This shows you the effects of clothespinning on the tree. Again, we put the clothespins back on there afterwards. You don't want to leave them on the tree after you've got the branches in place, because it'll end up causing problems with canker on the trunk. But just to show you the concept. One thing to be wary of in both all ages of trees is this idea of crotch angles, and you probably have heard this quite a bit, but these co-dominant limbs where you have two of the same size is a place where we run into problems. So take out that one or the other limbs as soon as you locate it, to avoid these weak areas that you can have breakage there. Also, if you have the clothespinning, helps to avoid some of these problems. So walking the block is a good idea. Plan your training ahead of time to avoid the large cuts on the scaffolds that attract canker problems. And you can see here on the left, there was a co-dominant limb that was taken out, and it should have been taken out the year before, and you can see some pretty darn big cuts here that are going to be hard for that tree to heal. And it lends itself to later canker problems. These just are hard to heal up. And you can see that effect in older orchards where pruning large limbs were taken out. And it's almost like I call a waterline effect, where you see a series of blackish areas where canker is working in there. And you know that's where big limbs were taken out at a later time. So again, plan ahead on that. Ends of limbs are, particularly in young orchards where you're trying to train the major scaffolds, pay attention to the ends of the limbs. Quite often there's a cluster of sprouts at the end of the limb, what we call a krill, and these can be ½ inch apart, multiple. If you ignore those, it leads to a cluster of branches, and then trying to clear those branches out with a rather big cut leads to canker problems. So try to take care of that ahead of time. And one strategy to do that is to, if you see it kind of late, you can do a bench cut to a strong side limb. This is not a particularly strong one here. And as a result, you have to come back and clean up the area, because the branches that are right by that heading cut that you made there will end up being fairly strong. Then you have the same type of thing to clean out, and again, canker problems. One strategy that the sweet cherry folks started, and I've been using it on peaches, if you happen to go through and you notice these developing scaffolds, particularly within 5 feet of the ground, that are doing this krill thing, you can reach up there with your fingers and clean off most of the buds in that zone. You might leave 2 up there. If you're really gutsy, you can leave just 1 there facing in the direction you want that sprout to go. The result is that you get a clean area right below where that terminal bud was, that the branches are much more well behaved, and you don't have that need to make the big cuts on it. So it's just a tip, the debudding technique. And the result of it is pretty striking on the tree. On the left, you can see the kind of the zigzag dogleg effect that you get where a strong limb was taken out and left us maybe some co-dominant things. And here on the right, you can see trees where we practice this debudding effect. And look how smooth these scaffolds are. You know that this is not going to be a canker site here in this very important part of the tree. Now, one thing that you'll see, the heading cut here does slow down the extension of the scaffold, so you get a thicker diameter. So you may have to do some using strapping because these branches tend to be a little spindly. So keep an eye on that too. So on to some of what I call the peach growth habit challenges. Peach tree has a strong apical dominance. The top of the tree wants to shade out the bottom of the tree. Peach was originally a forest tree before it was domesticated. And so as a result, under tight conditions, the top of the tree will have the growth, and the lower part of the tree is kind of abandoned by the tree. And the tree does quite well if you grow trees without training close together, say in a nursery. They will live longer than a commercial orchard. And it's as long as the top of the tree has light. So that's a problem. The problem with the apical dominance in an orchard that we're trying to get fruit out of is that there's a tendency to lose the fruit production in the lower and inner canopy of the tree. So light is an important commodity within a peach tree that we need to handle correctly. And this is compounded by the fact that we don't really have effective dwarfing rootstock for peach. There are some out there, but they are not recommended because of from a hardiness standpoint or other disease problems. I want to shift into talking about training systems on peach. And up to now, I've been talking about general health of the tree and how to promote it, growing conditions. Now I'm going to focus in on training systems. And I want to re-echo what I said before. If you had great luck in keeping trees alive and they've been protective for you, then I'm not advocating that you switch to other systems out there, unless for your own entertainment. The open center is the traditional favorite, and across the US, it's still the favorite. There are some other systems out there that have been used. Central Leader is one that's been used quite a bit. More recently, the Y, the Quad, and Hex are systems that have been championed in California and the East Coast, Pennsylvania in particular. And the Palmet is another system that some people like, and there are a few other ones as well. So one thing to focus in on is that the open center tree is probably the most relaxed style, and is can adapt to all different types of trees that you might get from the nurseries. And you can plant those at low to medium density. Central Leader is a little bit more of a stricter design, but there's some flexibility in it. The Y, Quad, and Hex are a little stricter design, so you need to watch what you're doing a little bit closer, particularly in the first couple of years, to be successful with that. The Palmet's a little bit more flexible. UFO is more of a strict design, as is the Spindle. So if you're thinking about tree walls, then you want something that's more of a a palmet, UFO, or spindle. You can sort of do a tree wall with a Y, quad, or hex, but it's not quite as adaptable to a tree wall. And also the other thing is how many trees per acre are you willing to put down? The more trees you put down per acre, the earlier you get into full production with that block. But so all these things are taken into consideration. If you've been attracted by tree walls, for most folks, I don't think that's a good idea. I think if you have a pretty big operation and you want to try to get away from hand labor by doing things like the blossom thinner, using a hedger, or using a platform, then, but I think you'd have to have 40, 50 plus acres to justify that, maybe more than that. And you probably need to use that equipment in other systems like apples to help pencil it out. On central leader, I'd have to confess that I've done a lot of central leader plantings here, and it makes sense for upright trees, some of the processing peaches, and a few varieties that tend to be more upright, but peaches tend to be more of a sprawly tree, and so the central leader is not ideal. There's a tendency for the center of the central leader to mature sooner than the lower branches. So you end up managing a couple of different trees. And you also have to really be on top of things to make sure that the top of the central leader does not kind of take over the tree and shade out the bottom. So as you might get from my comments here, I'm not a real fan of it. Spindle is sort of like a smaller version of a central leader tree. And certainly you can do a tree wall planting with that, blossom thinning. This one too, it shares some of the same characteristics of the central leader in that the top has a tendency to get strong. The other thing that is tricky with the central leader with a spindle tree is that doing the pruning cuts to get the wood keep coming out. I'm always reluctant to do close pruning on a central leader tree, because if you get canker on the trunk of the tree halfway up, you're pretty much losing that tree. So over time, I like to have the pruning cuts take place away from the central leader, away from the trunk of the tree. So if you run into a problem there, you can take that limb out and you haven't lost the tree. So there's a lot of work. We have plantings, there are growers that try these, and we've done quite a bit of it, but they look good for the first 8 years, 10 years, but then they get lose a few crops, and then they get, I think, unmanageable. So here's some general strategies for training trees, regardless of the system. I think that for just about all the systems, except for the spindle tree and the palmet, heading at planting, because you're trying to encourage a stronger limbs toward the bottom. And the where you put the heading cut depends on the training system. And I'll give some more details on that. In general, with a peach tree, we want to whip the tree or at least bring it down to just a few buds left on the branches. And with all these systems, you'll want to do a pretty good job removing those branches within for the ground for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So always the question when you plant the tree, how big of a stub should you leave? How much should you take off? And it depends a little bit if on the health of the tree. If you're thinking that the trees may not be look as healthy or as ready to grow as you like, then I tend to leave a little bit longer stubs. If you know that the tree is raring to go, that's the advantage of having a nursery nearby where you can go and look at the trees in the field. If you have that type of information, then you might be able to leave shorter stubs. The longer stub that you leave, the more you're kind of tied into what angle the stubs were when you bought the tree. So Sometimes you'll do a kind of a mixture of the two. One thing to watch though, when you do leave a bit of a stub there, is to come back and make sure you single that out so you don't have two strong branches coming out of the growth, because then you end up having a kind of a wimpy side branch coming. I'm going to start focusing on open center tree. Again, looking at the pictures that were provided me, that a lot of you folks are doing a great job with open center trees. So if you have branches that look real good, right angles, the angles where you want them to be, then I have no problem with leaving longer branches. But if you have some questions whether the angle's right, then stub them back. Then there's various ways that you can start out your initial scaffolds. I think having at least 2 scaffolds to begin with, and maybe growing some side branches off it to end up with 4 to 5, maybe 6 major scaffolds. Remember, with peaches, they're pretty good at growing side branches, so you don't have to have all your branches within that first year. Here's an example of a open center tree showing good scaffold development. As you can see, there's a lot of extra growth here, and so you'll have to go through and take out the branches before they get too big and cause problems down the road. You can see that we have some of these codominant limbs here in the end that you'll need to take care of in that system. But I'd be happy with that. I like the separation of the branches on those scaffolds. One thing that if you're trying to train a peach tree that you may want to consider doing is kind of a tweaking the tree through limb breaking. And one of the things that with a peach tree that you like to develop is, with an open center tree, is kind of an open area so the sunlight can get in. And one way that people do that is doing what we call bench cuts. So you cut to an outward facing branch and you kind of force the growth out there. Another technique is called breaking, tweaking the tree, is where you partway through the season, you just break the branches that you're not going to want toward the inside of the tree. And what it does is that it occludes the center here and kind of forces the tree to go out. And the process of breaking those limbs signals to the tree that, I'll give up on those branches, but it's a kind of a gradual effect. And so you can see later when the leaves are off the tree, the effect of the broken branches there. Here they are here, and you can see that the tree is given up on them, and the tree has already started the healing process there. So you can come in either now or next spring and take those out, and the tree is already 2/3 the way healed on it. And so you get the benefits of spreading, but also where the tree is now putting its energy in the branches that it really wants to keep there. So it's a kind of a neat technique, and I have to credit Kevin Day from University of California, who talked about this. If you looked at some of the older peach training information, it's mentioned in there too as well. So you want to do this a couple times in midsummer and second and third leaf trees. And so I consider this a supplement to, or an alternative to, bench cuts, which I'm not a real fan of. So again, here's a nice open center tree showing nice distribution of branches that helps with the water conducting in the tree, the nutrients movement in the tree, and it, in my opinion, leads to less problems with winter damage, where you have areas where the tree isn't hardening off properly because you can't have the flow of liquids within the tree is impeded. Too many scaffolds, as you can imagine, is a plumbing nightmare inside that tree, and so it leads to all sorts of problems down the road. So take care of that ahead of time. So open center tree, nice scaffolds, good crotch angles here. Also, I want to bring your attention to the fact that we're getting quite a bit of shade inside the middle of this tree. So there really needs to be a strategy for handling light into the tree. And I'll be talking about some of the concepts to handle that, but I want to bring that to your attention. So one scaffold system that is sometimes used on peaches is this 3 scaffold open center, where there's kind of a knot of 3 trees. Normally, I don't like to have, several branches scaffolds arising from the same location. But if you have it in this configuration, then you have good water flow within the tree. However, if you have the kind of some abrupt angles, uprights here, it's not a real great picture, but you can see that these would be areas where the water would collect and it'd be a kind of a plumbing issue and a canker magnet as time goes on. On to the freestanding Y system, fairly structured, less complex than the open center. It's sometimes easier for people to train your help to work on the system because they don't have to make all the complicated decision on the open center tree that requires a relatively high nursery tree. Because the first thing you do with a Y tree is that you head it pretty close to the ground, 1.5 to 2 foot tall. And so as a result, you are depending on that tree having enough horsepower and good buds down there so that it'll push out sprouts there. And this is an example here where the tree didn't have good buds there coming from the nursery and really didn't put out any growth. After you do the heading cut, then at about 12 inches of growth here, you go through and you start pinching back the stuff that aren't satisfactory, ones that are facing other trees. And then you can start heading the tree toward, having 2 arms to it, but you want to leave more than that so that when you get around to selecting the limbs in the following year, you have good choices. If you don't have good growth, then you can do some pinching and kind of force out growth, but get to that early on. Again, you need a good, vigorous tree. Some people prefer a June budded tree, some of the Southeast nurseries, because it tends to be more of a reliable grower. So here it shows the tree. Normally we don't do this in the snow, but this is when we have to be out there taking pictures. So this shows a couple of good scaffold limbs here facing out into the row, and we'll make a head and cut here. So you want to, I greatly recommend using bamboo as a way to get the angles where you want. And again, we don't do this in the snow, but makes a great picture to have it white behind it. You tie the bamboo together, use something like a tube tie. Maxi tapener doesn't do the job. And so you can see over the season, several iterations of tying it to the bamboo. And you end up with a pretty darn good tree. This is, so this shows you one of the arms of the open center tree, and you can get some pretty good light exposure because you have a fairly simplified structure. And you can bet that this system had bamboo on it earlier. I've seen people use a trellising to do that, to maintain the angles. But if you use the bamboo right, then I think you can do a pretty fine job. Switch over next to the UFO training system. And this is, I would say, more experimental. There's a lot more information on this in Sweet Cherries, championed by people like Greg Lang at Michigan State University, Matt Whiting out of Washington State, and others. Those who have been on the International Fruit Tree Association tours have seen some of these. And to see what's going on here, I can show you in the wintertime. You can have it as a single arm, whereby one tree has only one arm going out, or you can have it as a 2-arm system. And the components of it are the kind of a structural limb down here and uprights, and the fruiting wood comes off of the uprights. And these things are set up so that the first couple of years of training is critical. The angle of your original branches there, what we call cordon, and having the offshoots at the spacing that we need to have them, which is about 16 to 20 inches apart. Again, this shows you a commercial block that looks very fine up in Grand Rapids area. The Rash, Jake and Chuck Rash. But then thinking about what to do on training this part of the tree is still somewhat of a work in progress. It shows you one of the upright arms and pretty good peach and really good color with that system. Nice tree wall system. They do hedge. We've used blossom thinners in there and does a pretty nice job. So it shows you 20 fruit on that. And the advantage is that there's uniformity of ripening, labor savings, but it does take some work. Palmet is another system I sort of like. It has a combination of a tree wall, but it's kind of the more laissez-faire of a open center tree. And it shows you the arms of it. Usually I start out with an unheaded tree. Sometimes you can head it if the top of the tree is not looking good or heading the way I want. And then you let the side branches grow. And you kind of take them as they come. And so they're kind of straddling back and forth like that. And then if there's a gap here, then you let a side branch fill in the area. And here it shows you some of the development of it. Older tree here, staggered arrangement, as shown here, is better. You don't really want to have them side by side because it tends to choke off the further development of the tree. So you'll need like the 15 to 20 inches between major parts of the tree so that there's enough room for fruiting wood. And so it's a very productive system. You do need to have ladders in the system. Pedestrian type of palmet is not very practical in my opinion. One thing that for both the UFO system for the palmet system and even for the spindle system is some sort of support structure. Here on the left, you can see the grower used high tensile wire that was covered by discarded trickle tube tape. And here we use the white safety coated horse fence wire. You see it in horse pastures. And it does reduce the amount of rubbing, but we still see some rubbing damage. Probably this age of orchard here, the caliper, we don't need that wire in there anyway. It's really to get the tree up to its initial shape. Okay, a few comments now on keeping older trees productive. The whole idea of keeping fruiting wood close to the support trees structures, limbs, is important. And this is something that you have to work on. Those of you may have seen the article on stubbing that I had in the American Fruit Grower. So I was kind of expanding on that. So you're planning ahead, looking at where you want the regeneration. But really, on all different training systems, you have that same concept. And this shows you a branch here that, I'm not sure if this is an open center, but you can see this, maybe the original intent was to have the fruiting wood come off the scaffold. And you see initially the fruiting cylinder where the fruiting wood was probably around the scaffold here, but you can see over time with the older branches that the fruiting surface is moving out. So we actually have developing where the side branches are the support structure where the fruiting wood is coming off of, which is okay if you want that training system, but just to realize that how the game has changed the fruiting structure system. So be aware of this idea of where you're renewing back to, cutting back to is important. With same thing with the UFO system, the fruiting cylinders are these uprights, and you have to be really careful to do your stubbing cuts back to that so that you don't have the game being where the fruiting is out here at the ends of the branches. And so this cut is basically you leave a long shoot and a short shoot area. And so here it shows the long shoot, you cut it off here and then you can see the fruit on that shoot will develop. And then we have a short shoot. It could be something that spontaneously comes out of the collar region, or it could be because we cut a stub here and we get the shoot out of it. So this is going to be the growth that develops the branch for next year's fruit. And this is the fruit for this year. And this whole process of thinking that way allows you to work on it. And sometimes the stubs are a little bit more complicated. There's several things going on, but the same idea is that you cut short so that you have growth, and then you have long where you have the fruiting. You have to be a little bit careful on your cuts here. This is a nice picture from Desmond Lane, where if you cut too close, then you kind of introduce canker in that situation. Those of you that have open center trees, particularly pedestrian type, you've been doing this type of cut whether you realize it or not. And it's where you cut back to the structure here. And it may be that you let the system go for a couple of years, but then you cut back and then you regrow the top. And sometimes these things are left, I call this a reindeer cut or antler cut, because you're taking off a cluster of branches that are multi-years old, but you kind of start again. And so again, take a look at it. It shows you another view of this. Those of you who like reading stuff, you might find a copy of the Physiological Fruit Tree Training for Intensive Growing by Bruner. It's about a 20-year-old book, 25-year-old book. And it lays out kind of the procedure whereby you started out by cutting a shoot on a young scaffold, you get sprouts out of it, and then next year you do the long cut and the short cut. The long cut has a fruit for that year, next year's shoot. And you can follow that through each year, you use that same type of system. So it's as I think is something to think about when you're out there pruning, and it's a way to keep systems under control by making sure you get the fruiting wood close to the structural wood. So I've given you here in the time that we've had a kind of an overview of I'd say the high points of peach tree training. Covered a lot of territory, and it may have been a bit much to cover, but I wanted to do the highlights. The good tree structures and critical to the health of the orchard. You need how to read the tree, look at the material that you have from the nursery, have a plan for that orchard, know what it's to look like, and then get a schedule so that you're doing the training at the proper time. You know, if you wait a year, you have compounding the problems. It's much better to tweak the tree as you go along than to prune harder trying to correct the problems.